This is the box axe. Was used prominently in turpentine production back around 1900, thereabouts, a few years before and a few years after. That was before actually we had tins, and the laborers would take this and cut a cavity in the bottom of a pine tree, preferably a slash, and cut the cavity big enough that would hold about 1.5 quarts of gum. We had a gentleman in Willacoochee that they said his father could cut a box axe and cut in roughly 32 licks, which was a pretty good feat in itself. But these were, like I say, prominently used around the turn of the century, actually before we came into tin production. This is a broad axe that was used right shortly after the box axe was used. We had production of tins, but with no nails. This was put right near the base of the tree. One gentleman held it right at the ground level, or about 6 inches above the ground. They'd take it and hold it against the tree, and another guy would take this maul and hit it hard here, make an indentation into the tree. Then they would reach and get a tin and stick it in that open area, and it would seal automatically. This was used before my time, but not too long before my time. But you find a few of these axes around, but it's kind of shaped like a half moon, and it'll fit against the tree. Fits pretty snug all the way around. About a 10 or 11-inch tree diameter, breast high. And just took a pretty hard lick to open up the cavity where you'd slip the tin in, move it, and it would seal without any problem. This is known as a maul. They were made in various configurations, but if you'll notice, this one was cut out as a whole piece of wood and whittled down on the handle end and left the big heavy end that you could swing it. The extra turpentine hand would, while his partner was holding the axe, he would back off and hit it one hard lick, and it'd make an indentation into the tree. They would pull the axe out and stick a tin in it, and it would seal itself without the use of any nails. So it was a pretty good idea. As time went on, we came up with various other means of cupping gum, but this was sufficient for that era of time, sometime after 1905. The tin was made of one piece of galvanized metal, I assume, and as the maul hit the broad axe, and as it was pulled from the tree, they took this tin and stuck it straight into that gash, so to speak, and it would seal itself without any nails. So it was a good way to seal the area here where the gum might go behind, because it was all closed, and what gum would run out of the tree would go right into the cut without any problem. This was called a tin puller. During that era of time when you didn't have a nail into the tin, when you went to elevate it, maybe at the end of the second year, you'd take this piece of tin puller and hook it into the tin and pick up on it, or either turn it over and push down on it, and it'd pull the tin out of the tree. You'd use the same tin to elevate the cup a couple of feet. And that was actually what it was used for. Very useful piece of equipment, saved buying tin. People had to be conservative, and that was one way they done it. When they went to raise the cup from ground level up to, say, waist high, this is a product put out by Cancel, and it's a piece that an average fella could take a small hammer and hit it himself, and take that piece of tin and insert it into the little area there, the little gash, and pull it right out, and it'd seal again at waist high level. And it was used primarily because one individual was able to do a job that it takes two people for at ground level. But very useful little piece of machinery. These are called calipers. First of all, when you're going through the woods to cut trees, we would use these to gauge the tree. We got paid from the government according to the size of the tree, the diameter breast high. Mostly, we would cup them 10 inches in diameter breast high. You'd stick the gauge there. If it was tight, you could go ahead and cup it because they had inspectors coming around to check behind you, because the government would pay you it's called a cost share program, would pay you something on the cost of your tins, double-headed nails, 40-penny nails, and cups to cup timber, but you had to do it according to their specifications. Very handy little thing. I still got the wire and the string on it where they'd put it on their belt, tote it on your belt, so you'd be toting other items also. But you take this, the first thing you do is stick it on the tree, just like that. If it fit, fine. If it's 9 inches, you can determine there you got an inch span there, you'd walk onto another tree. So very useful little instrument. Had to be pretty precise. I used these during my lifetime here on the farm with my father. I was, first of all, very interested in this, and secondly, it was always a job for us farm boys. We always had something to do in the woods, and we could go ahead and tote these along ourselves and carry a bush axe with us, and when we got to a tree that was sufficient in size, we would just take a bush axe and push it down, which I'll later demonstrate. Okay. This is called a bush axe. It's what we were led to believe it was called, and originally it was had a 3-inch head, but to show you the conservatism of a truly good turpentine farmer, he'd sharpen this thing till it was this size before he'd throw it away, and I just happened to keep it. This was used when you put the caliper on the tree and saw it was 10 inches. You'd take the long handle and hold it up and shove off the outside bark. Actually, there's two different types of these bush axes. This was a type that was earlier built. Sharpen this razor sharp across here with a file, then take it in this direction right near the ground, maybe 1.5 feet from the ground, shove the bark off slick where the tins would fit smooth without any excessive nails to cover up the tin holes. But that was a very important part, as well as cutting bushes from one tree to the other. This particular instrument was used to push down the tree. That's what we call removing the outer bark and fixing it before we could come back later and tack our tins and hang our cups on it. These axe handles a lot of times were made by the individual that was using them. They'd go off in the woods and cut them a piece of black gum, bring it and put it in a vise, and use a drawing knife principally to shape the handle and fit it so it would work right inside here with a tight squeeze. Have to beat it on to really make it work good. You've got wooden wedges that you could split it in the top and stick in there, or a lot of times we just take various sizes of nails and nail 2 or 3 in it to make it good and tight in the stock. The same was true with this type bush axe. If we couldn't buy a handle, we'd cut one and make it the same way. Just tighten it up in a vise and start using a drawing knife and whittle it down till you got it where it fit in the groove. Actually, the same thing could be said about hacks. The hack stocks, for instance, was the same way. You cut the grooves in them and smooth them down and fix them so the ball here would fit on them good and tight, and had a groove cut here. You could take the actual hack bill and stick it in and make it as tight as you can. Normally, we had little round pieces of something like an exhaust pipe, various sizes. It would slip down and tighten it up with a wooden chisel. Tighten it up till you got it good and tight. I just used a regular modern day clamp on this one, but it works efficient. This is a puller. Actually, for pulling yearling boxes, it's about shoulder high to me or a little higher. And actually, someone has welded a piece of a machete on the end of it. It's out of the way and it doesn't interfere with the pulling of the boxes. However, the only thing that I can figure out is that it was used in going from one tree to the other when gallberries and other weeds and stuff, bushes, grows up in your path. As you walk along, you could swing this and have it good and sharp and cut those out of your way as you made the way from one tree to the other. This is truly a homemade outfit, but I feel like it's had its purpose in its day. This is commonly called a puller. We worked our turpentine, most of it 5 years, and the faces would get pretty high. Sometimes you need a long handle puller to reach the distance up there 8 or 10 foot to pull the tree. This is made out of heart lightered wood. It's real slick. It's been used a lot. It even has the rosin still on the upper top of the puller handle. It's principally made like any other instrument. One of the most popular items that a turpentine farmer had was a drawing knife and a vise. He would put his handle in a vise and go to work on it. And then take a chisel and cut out the slot for the puller to set in. And he was in business when he got through with it. It's kind of time consuming, but people back then had more time than they did anything. And they didn't worry about how long it might have took to build it. These puller handles were homemade, like I was saying. If you could buy them in a store, even back then, you'd want to take a drawing knife and improvise them a little. The same way with hack stocks. You could buy hack stocks in the store, but it was a lot cheaper to make them yourself. A lot of times the type of wood that was used had something to do with it, because a hack that's made out of real soft wood wouldn't sustain the licking that it has to have, you know, from tree to tree. So something made out of lightered or hard wood, oak or whatnot, would be a lot more advantageous to a turpentine farmer than something that he would buy in the store was real soft. I mentioned lightered. This is the inside part of a tree. If you got a tree standing and lightning strikes and it begins to deteriorate, you'll always have a center cut that's hard as a brick. And this is what lightered, we call it in South Georgia, we call it lighter wood. We used to call it lightered as children. But this is what fence rails are made out of. That's the reason they last so long. They're made out of the very center of the tree, the part that normally doesn't deteriorate. This is commonly called a puller. We worked our turpentine, most of it 5 years, and the faces would get pretty high. Sometimes you need a long handle puller to reach the distance up there 8 or 10 foot to pull the tree. This is made out of heart lightered wood. It's real slick. It's been used a lot. It even has the rosin still on the upper top of the puller handle. It's principally made like any other instrument. One of the most popular items that a turpentine farmer had was a drawing knife and a vise. He would put his handle in a vise and go to work on it. And then take a chisel and cut out the slot for the puller to set in. And he was in business when he got through with it. It's kind of time consuming, but people back then had more time than they did anything. And they didn't worry about how long it might have took to build it. These puller handles were homemade, like I was saying. If you could buy them in a store, even back then, you'd want to take a drawing knife and improvise them a little. The same way with hack stocks. You could buy hack stocks in the store, but it was a lot cheaper to make them yourself. A lot of times the type of wood that was used had something to do with it, because a hack that's made out of real soft wood wouldn't sustain the licking that it has to have, you know, from tree to tree. So something made out of lightered or hard wood, oak or whatnot, would be a lot more advantageous to a turpentine farmer than something that he would buy in the store was real soft. I mentioned lightered. This is the inside part of a tree. If you got a tree standing and lightning strikes and it begins to deteriorate, you'll always have a center cut that's hard as a brick. And this is what lightered, we call it, in South Georgia, we call it lighter wood. We used to call it lightered as children. But this is what fence rails are made out of. That's the reason they last so long. They're made out of the very center of the tree, the part that normally doesn't deteriorate. I guess it was about 1960. Up until that time, we'd always used what was called a wood hack. It's got a different head altogether than the newer version of the bark hack. And we didn't use any acid or anything. It's been during my lifetime. But this was a type that was used, I guess, from the beginning of the turpentine industry. But then we, as 1960 or thereabouts came along, started using sulfuric acid. There's not a lot of demonstrations using a bark hack with a wide head, a flat head, and we would only just move the bark off the tree and a little bit of the membrane, which made it somewhat easier for the turpentine hand. And when he chipped the tree, turned around and take the acid and spray it. And we had pretty good results, and practically everybody did, because they eventually went to that route. Rather than using the old heavy wood hack, they'd use what they commonly called the bark hack. This is another version of the bark hack. The acid came into use about 1960. A lot of experimentation had been done, H3SO4, and it actually increased the production of the gum. It would draw the gum out of the streak somehow or another. When you put the acid on it, it'd have a tendency to pull the vein of gum out of the tree. As you progressed up the tree, you'd use a bottle like this. When it got to be in what we call snatch boxes, or beginning to turn it from a hack to a puller, you would use this. You enable you to reach a little higher. And as the tree progressed, and maybe you got into the 3.5 to the 4th year, we used what was called an acid puller. This acid puller is not complete in the fact that the spout is missing and the stem down through the middle, but the bottle sit right here. When you pull the tree, when you turn around and pull it, when you finish, you take a hold of the acid bottle and squeeze it, and the acid would flow out the top. You had to be careful. Acid, when it was very windy, would penetrate your clothes and literally would destroy them in a few days. But a fella really pulling boxes, he'd really prefer a good steel day, but we didn't pick that time. But this is an acid puller, which there are not many of them around, but this is what it was used for. We had one of our turpentine hands named Otis Spivey, was the first employee we had to use acid. And we had one crop of boxes near here. He worked one half of the boxes, and Jimmy Cheney, another employee, used the the wood hack. Otis used the bark hack. And we kept up with the gum, but it's been so many years ago, it was around 1960, but I believe Otis outproduced Jimmy with his amount of trees. Each one had roughly the same amount of trees, but the bark hack showed a preference over the wood hack. Not only was it easier to use, it ran a little more gum. In gum production, we had to have some way of holding the gum, a reservoir for catching the gum. And this Hurdy cup, this clay cup, was used with one nail, drove right underneath the streak and the tin. And the gum would run down the face into this Hurdy cup. It had its usefulness, but yet during the winter months, they had to go around and pull it off the tree and turn it bottoms upwards, because if there's any water inside, it would bust each cup. So it was a kind of a labor-intensive thing. They eventually moved to what is called the bird eye cup, a little three-corner that fit the same way with a nail hole right in the middle. and it would sit there and catch the gum. It was a reservoir for the gum production, and it was emptied in essentially the same way. A lot of times these farmers made little wooden paddles with a drawing knife and a piece of wood, and they'd pattern it so it would reach down in the bottom, preferably more like a trowel, and reach down into the sharp corners of the bottom to empty it so they wouldn't lose any of the gum. Then as the years progressed, after leaving this, I guess during my lifetime, they came out with galvanized and later aluminum cups. This cup happens to be a 2-quart cup, half a gallon cup. They first started out with a quart cup, which was half his size. But then they seen that if they had a bigger cup, it would hold more gum, thereby eliminating having to dip so many times a year. So actually it cut the dipping in half, the actual getting of the harvesting of the gum out of the cup. And these would hold a lot. It wouldn't take many of these to fill a bucket and then a barrel. But used a lot of these during my lifetime. This is a hanging box. The employees, when we went through the woods and got the trees pushed down with our axe, 10 inches diameter breast high, we'd walk up to the tree with this. You carry it this way, put 40 penny nails in this end, and we normally had this cup nailed here with a couple of nails and put double-headed nails in it. We'd put gutters in one section and aprons in the other. These were all handmade. Each employee made his own box. Some were a little bigger, some a little smaller. They'd reach and get their tins and proceed with the hanging, which we'll demonstrate later. But this thing weighed right smart. If they had a good big box, some of them didn't want to go back to the wagon very regular, so he'd fix a big box and put a large quantity of tins in it. But they were pretty heavy toting from one tree to the other. We'd go ahead of time and throw the cups out, so he didn't have to bother about a cup because it was already at the tree. When he got to the tree, set this down, he reached and got him some shingle nails, put the apron and gutter together, proceeded to nail them with 5 nails preferably, and then he would set the cup under the apron, hit that 40 penny nail a good hard lick, and set the cup in there and snap it to. That's principally, right quick, tells about the demonstration of cupping boxes. But this is the instrument that they toted around from tree to tree, filled with everything that he'd need for his job that day. Some employees could cup as much as 350 boxes a day. I was a tally man, and I always found it quite interesting. They had a certain voice, certain name that they would holler, and I'd put it on a tally sheet for them. But very interesting. It was just a part of that era of time. This is a two-piece tin that we always used during my era of time of helping up to 1978. This is a gutter and this is an apron. First of all, we hook these two together just like so. Put one nail through both of them. Then elevate your gutter apron as high as you want it so that the gum flow would go down here and into the cup. Took one nail here, one here, one here, one here, and one here. Most of the time, if you slanted those nails a little on the apron and on the gutter, if there was a little gap there where gum might leak through as you put it at an angle, it'd pull that piece of tin tight, therefore eliminating the crack that you would lose gum. Hard to tack them perfect, but most people, when they were into the so-called whang of things, they could tack them and make them look like a picture. Then we had one guy coming behind with an old wood hack. He'd put the initial streak straight across, and there we'd be through. We'd be ready for gum production in the spring. This is known as a scrape box. You could take this and set it on the ground right in front of where the cup sits. If it's a virgin box and it's been worked, say, 2 years and it's up about 3 feet high. We do this in the winter months when the gum has ceased to run or be in production. We go there and collect the rosin off the face of the tree. The longleaf tree has lots of rosin. A slash doesn't have a whole heap, but we try to get it all. It don't bring as much as regular water white or winter glass or the various grades of gum that you get from gum production, but yet it's part of the integral part of salvaging what we could. Had a little slot that was homemade here. We nailed a little piece of iron across the side to put the dip paddle in, because we need it first of all to clean the cup out. Then, as the trees began to be worked higher, when it got to be in pulling boxes, we would nail a leg on each side and elevate it up 3 feet in the air. Made it a little aggravating about toting around, but actually when you got to the tree and used this one piece of instrument right here, this is a scrape iron, we would take it and go over the complete part of the face of the tree, scraping that white rosin off and letting it fall in here as much as possible. Then we'd reach down and take the cup and take our dip paddle there and dip the cup into the tree. In other words, visualize this being a full cup of gum. We'd take this dip paddle and take it and rake through and put it in here. And it would hold, it'd take about 8 or 9 of these to make a standard barrel of gum. But these were handy little devices. They were cut and built in such a manner they would fit against a tree with a little leaning and they wouldn't fall. So you were able to salvage most of the scrape as you pulled it down off the tree. This is known as a dip bucket. This is one of the most useful pieces of equipment that a turpentiner used, because when he used this, he knew he was fixing to get some money out of his gum. Take this bucket, which is flat on one side, in toting it from one tree to the other, you tote it with a flat side to your leg. Therefore, no tar will get on you, no gum. But if you mistakenly touch it here, that's where all your drippings come. When you dip the tree and wipe the paddle off, a little begin to run down the front. At the end of the day, you'd have a lot of gum running down, so you wouldn't want to turn that thing backwards, but the flat side is where you'd hold it against you. A lot of turpentine farmers would take their children and carry them to the woods versus an actual row crop farmer, he'd carry them out in the field. These turpentine farmers would go into the woods and they'd carry little 10-pound lard buckets for their boys, 6, 8, 10-year-old, and improvise with a little wooden paddle. And they couldn't dip much, but they'd help their daddy all they could. And that was all part of making a living in the woods. I remember a story right quick that me and my brother was dipping in a little cypress pond down the road here many years ago, and I had a small bucket. They actually made one about 3/4 this big. And I had my little bucket full of gum and started out of this cypress pond. And I tripped on a cypress knee, and as I fell forward, it was in July or August when the gum was just as soft as water. And I didn't want to lose my gum, therefore I dropped it straight down, and when I did, I fell over it. And it sloshed that soft tar all over my shirt, arms, face. And I probably cried, but there was a neighbor living nearby. Bertie Mae Spivey lived in a little log house there, and I walked up to her house, and a farmer always kept kerosene at home, and she took that kerosene and got that little shirt off of me and cleaned me up. And that's been over 50 years ago, and I still remember her and love her for that act of goodness that she sent my way. Turpentine farming wouldn't be complete without the use of mules, and we kept 5 on our farmstead from even when we moved up here in 1946 through 1978 when we ceased production of gum. And we have a lot of stories to be told about the mules, but this is some of the gear. This is a collar, mule collar, and this is a hames. We had little rubber tired wagons that we pulled in the woods and usually carrying 3 to 4 barrels. And that's about what a good dipper would dip in a day. some of the time we had breeches to go on the mules. They were entailed with a good bit of leather, but they went around the rear shanks of the mule and hooked up there near to the collar, and also the long pieces hooked to the shaves, and that enabled the mule, when he was going downhill with a heavy load, to keep the mule from getting his legs skint. We had one particular man, of course, it's according to what era I'm talking about, but for several years we had one man that tended to our 5 mules. He would keep their manes trimmed, he'd check their feet, be sure their hooves was in good shape, and try to do a good job with the leather. He would grease it back in that time and keep the hames and the collar in good workable condition. Also, he'd check the wagons, the little Hoover wagons they were called, and be sure the air was in the tires and that all bolts was tightened and the shaves wasn't loose and the flooring was in good workable condition. We had 5 mules here on the farm most of the time during my era of turpentine production, and we would haul the mules from here as far as 20 miles on the back of our pickup truck and pull wagons, and sometimes it'd take 2 weeks to finish that particular amount of trees there before the mule would get to come back home. And we kept a crib full of corn downstairs, and we'd always sack up a croaker sack full of corn and a couple of bales of hay and carry with us and be sure that the mule had ample water. And Daddy always required us to take the corn and break it in half so the mules wouldn't get choked. He always had that theory. He said he didn't want a mule to get choked over in the woods eating the corn, so we boys would always break it in half. One particular story was about a mule we had by the name of Doc, and we were over in Berrien County cupping some boxes, and it was real wet, and we had to cross a little creek near the Lappahaw River. And as we started across, my truck stopped, and we had 7 or 8 men trying to push it out, and none of us could move it. And one particular employee was on the other side of the creek with a big mule we had, Doc, and he was hooked to a wagon. So we backed the wagon right near the pickup and hook a chain from the front bumper to the back of the wagon. And when he clucked to Doc to pull the truck out, the mule's tail, when he tightened up on the load, the mule's tail just stuck straight out. And the amazing thing was that I was in the truck and I felt that truck begin to move, and I was trying to help what I could. But that's an interesting story showing the strength of some of those big mules, how strong they were. He was on good solid ground, but we men were the men that was trying to push the wagon. The truck was down in the water, but the mule was far superior. Another thing, that one reason we used mules so much, we had little 3-path roads around in the woods, and you could drive most anywhere. We burned the woods, before we cupped them. And some of our employees that worked the mules so much, one particular mule named Blue, he could call her, and she would bring his wagon out through the bushes. And if she ran up against a tree as she walked slowly, she would back up and move the shafts one way or the other and get off the tree and come on to him. He'd holler and say, "Come on, Blue." And that mule would come right to him when he had a bucket of gum, saving him toting that 60-pound. Way across the woods, the mule would come to him. That happened in a lot of cases. During that era of time when, well, actually, the whole time, people always used mules, even back before 1900, mules and wagons. But as time elapsed and we were able to obtain pickup trucks, that was handy about hauling hands back into the woods where we haul them as much as 15 or 20 miles. We'd carry them and place them out at various points where their workplace was, and we'd pick them up late in the afternoon. And that was one good thing about the pickup trucks. But then beyond that, Daddy always tried to have a bigger truck about hauling the gum from the place that it was gathered to the selling place over in Douglas. We had an old truck that would hold 37 barrels, and we would put 37 on it. Daddy never did want us to carry a piece of a load. He wanted to carry a full load, and we would wait till we had a full load. We'd pick it up in various points around in the woods. We learned early in life to cut skid poles. Skid poles were little small 4 to 6 inch pine trees. We'd cut them down, sharpen the ends of them off, put them on the truck. When we get to our loading place, you pull them out and notch particularly notch two ends where it would fit and wouldn't slip on the tailgate. Then two men would take it and push those barrels, 550 pound, up those skids and onto the truck. And then someone will jump up in there and set it up. You had special places to set it. It had to be stacked perfect for it to hold 37 barrels. But we always needed the mules and wagons because they'd go down little three-path roads, and sometimes, like I said about Blue, they would go in places there wasn't even a road. Just go across the clean woods to where the master was calling, "Come, come," and the mule would come. I always related that to a lot of things in life. During that era of time when, well, actually, the whole time, people always used mules, even back before 1900, mules and wagons. But as time elapsed and we were able to obtain pickup trucks, that was handy about hauling hands back into the woods where we haul them as much as 15 or 20 miles. We'd carry them and place them out at various points where their workplace was, and we'd pick them up late in the afternoon. And that was one good thing about the pickup trucks. But then beyond that, Daddy always tried to have a bigger truck about hauling the gum from the place that it was gathered to the selling place over in Douglas. We had an old truck that would hold 37 barrels, and we would put 37 on it. Daddy never did want us to carry a piece of a load. He wanted to carry a full load, and we would wait till we had a full load. We'd pick it up in various points around in the woods. We learned early in life to cut skid poles. Skid poles were little small 4 to 6 inch pine trees. We'd cut them down, sharpen the ends of them off, put them on the truck. When we get to our loading place, you pull them out and particularly notch two ends where it would fit and wouldn't slip on the tailgate. Then two men would take it and push those barrels, 550 pound, up those skids and onto the truck. And then someone will jump up in there and set it up. You had special places to set it. It had to be stacked perfect for it to hold 37 barrels. But we always needed the mules and wagons because they'd go down little three-path roads, and sometimes, like I said about Blue, they would go in places there wasn't even a road. Just go across the clean woods to where the master was calling, "Come, come," and the mule would come. I always related that to a lot of things in life. This is one of the first parts of gum production. It's cleaning off the face. We call it pushing down with a bush axe, clearing the face, getting it ready to tack the tins, hang the nail, and put the cups on. Then we'll come later with a streak, and that'll start the actual gum flowing. So I'll proceed with that. I've been doing this type work since I was a boy back in the late 40s and early 50s. Was an active participant in it for a number of years. We quit the gum production back in 1978, my brothers and my father and me. But it's always been a very interesting thing to me, and I'm afraid as time goes on, we might lose this frame of history. And I put these few faces up the side of the road here merely as an educational point of view. I wanted people passing the road to see what was going on, and if they wanted to stop and look, that was fine. But I particularly wanted my grandchildren to know that this was part of our heritage and has been for 200 years for people in the state of Georgia and up the coastline. But the first thing I'll do is push this tree down. That's what we call it, with a bush axe. We try to keep the bush axe pretty sharp. I haven't done this work since the early 70s. But I don't think I've forgotten exactly how that it's done, but I believe I can do it. This part of production of gum, installation of the tins and cups and putting on our first streak, begins in the late winter, usually in February and March. And we'll put our first streak on latter part of March or 1st of April. Consists of two pieces of tin, an apron and a gutter. You attach both of them together like so. Push the face down slick with a bush axe. Put your knee around here so you won't lose your balance. Come down here. tack the tin like that. This needs to be level. I got finger. Okay. This is a typical example of just what the trees look like, the chipping procedure. Actually, this is virgin, call it virgins from here right on up as high as you can chip with a hack like this. Then when we get along here, we turn it to a puller and we pull it for 3 more years. Actually, this has been worked too. So normal lineage for it is a 5-year lease that we would get on the timber. This is a demonstration of the actual chipping. This hack is pretty sharp, you see. And you just take off the outer edge of the wood, reverse yourself when you come down to the middle, start on the other side. Operation's complete. Doesn't take long. One man normally works 5,000 or 6,000 trees every 2 weeks. And it takes 2 streaks like that in the summertime to make a ½ gallon of gum. But early spring, it'd take 3 streaks. You could usually dip every month to 6 weeks. Later in the summer, usually every month. 2 good streaks would fill up the cup, then you need to dip it. But it's usually a 5-year procedure, working it through the summer and the fall. And in the winter time is when we scrape the trees and we finish up with it. And then it lies idle for about 3 months. When you get a full bucket, which is about 20 cups, tote it near the barrel and set it down. Takes about 8 buckets to fill up this barrel and make 435 pounds of crude gum inside the barrel. I want to pour this up and get ready for another dipping. Here goes. It's pretty there. That's what water white looks like. This gum that I just poured in the barrel was made last year. First streaks was put on late April, early May, and had several dippings there. And I just had the 4 trees with 6 faces, and it makes a good 55 to 60 pound per year. It's a little enterprise that maybe won't be plumb forgotten. But the quality of the gum, I'm amazed, is still pretty. It's got a good color to it. This gum, like I say, was made, and all gum was made from early spring till the beginning to the middle of fall is when gum production ceases to flow. This yellow color is kind of an insignia of my dad, Gillis Carter. We always painted our barrels yellow. When you get them to the tar steel, we would never be involved in getting our barrels mixed up with someone else's. We tried to keep them in good repair. These are what they call blue whistlers. They'll actually hold 435 pounds of gum, plus the barrel weighs roughly 110 pounds, making a total of 545 pounds. That's pretty well prominent, give or take 5 or 10 pounds for the amount of tar sometimes it's on the outside of the barrel. But that's what's called a standard barrel. Before the time of these steel barrels, we had wooden barrels with oak staves. And we'd always put them in a water hole, because if you leave them out of the water hole very long, the staves would shrink and they become cracks in them. And there's nothing no aggravating when you go to load some gum and the gum go to seeping out of all those cracks. Therefore, we put them in a water hole. The water swells up the oak staves, makes them good and tight. Therefore, they're kind of like a blue whistler, even though they're made from oak. This particular stump has what is called a box cut. Even around the turn of the century and before, when they didn't have any tins or nails or whatnot, they came up with an idea that they could take a box axe and cut into the side of the tree. And this cavity would hold roughly 1.5 quarts of gum. They would whittle out a wooden spoon, or I saw one that's been bought that was used to dip that with. This is laying on its side, but it needs to be inverted and put in the ground. But this is a pretty typical cavity, one of the best that I've got. I got a few. But this is what they used, like I say, around the turn of the century and before, maybe in the late 1800s. And it was just a prominent way of life. They take that big axe and make about 30 to 35 cuts into the green part of the tree at the root, and waller out a big hole and start chipping the tree up above it. And the gum would run down in that cavity, that base of that cavity, and stay there till you come along and dipped it. But it was a very interesting way of life. But this is a fast receding art. It's something that you don't see anywhere. Usually the naval forestry units has one. Occasionally you'll find them, but they're very few and far between. But it's just a way of life that I've always admired. Anybody that would go to that kind of trouble trying to get a little bit of tar, we call it a pine turpentine, out of a tree. My name is Gillis Carter, Willacoochee, Georgia. Okay. When I was very small, one of the first things that I might have done, and I recall, I'd get on the dip wagon and ride with the dipper around in the woods. Maybe Daddy was coming through the woods on a little old truck, and I'd ride with him, and we'd go through the little 3-path roads around, and Daddy would check. We didn't have a woods rider. Back then, as a person that gets on a mule or horse and rides the woods, so call it, and he would check behind the employees to be sure that they were getting every tree. But Daddy would drive the roads periodically and be sure that the work was done, you know, like it should be. But I started at an early age using a small bucket, dipping. And I'd done more dipping, me and my older brother Jesse, than any other thing on the gum production, except as I got older, I did a lot of the heavy pushing and loading and hauling off to the still. In the fall of the year, we done a lot of tree burning. We'd go in and we'd plow fire lines and work and burn a section of land, and then that's when we would start cutting trails and pushing down, cupping the timber and starting chipping in early spring or about that time and get the gum flowing. But it's been an interesting career, something I'm very much interested in and take pride in knowing a little something about it. My name's Gillis Carter. I was raised on this farm since 1946. We moved here north of Willacoochee, and my daddy, prior to that, had been in the turpentine business since the early 20s. And he and mother made their livelihood turpentining, and daddy didn't like to farm much, so we usually had around 60,000 or 6 crops up most of the time during the course of years there that I was even involved, from the early 50s right on through 1978 when we stopped production of gum. I've been doing this type work since I was a boy back in the late 40s and early 50s. Was an active participant in it for a number of years. We quit the gum production back in 1978, my brothers and my father and me. But it's always been a very interesting thing to me, and I'm afraid as time goes on, we might lose this frame of history. And I put these few faces up the side of the road here merely as an educational point of view. I wanted people passing the road to see what was going on, and if they wanted to stop and look, that was fine. But I particularly wanted my grandchildren to know that this was part of our heritage and has been for 200 years for people in the state of Georgia and up the coastline. It's been a good life for us. You're out in the open, plenty of fresh air, and a lot of good people that'll help you work. And we've worked many people in this area, and most of them have been excellent employees.